well, you write about this.
Indeed.
About this moment in your book.
It's an amazing scene.
Why do we laugh?
Indeed, why do we laugh? And it still brings a smile.
Chapman died, he drank too much.
Indeed. But what's beautiful about the scene is the way that, at one level, Cleese taps into our fury at the dead. Do those we love ever have the right to depart? Do people who die always frustrate, disappoint, and make us enraged, angry with them for having left us here, alone, without their help? And so, at one level, Cleese taps into our fury at the dead, and on another level, he pinpoints exactly what was specific to Graham Chapman. He calls him a freeloading bastard instead of the kind of language we'd expect to hear at a memorial service, the kind of false language. He was a great guy, he was a wonderful man, and so on. So he indexed what's most real about that person. And one of the ironies of mourning, I think, is that it's very often only after someone has died, it can be years after that, that we can come to understand something about who they really were. And one could say that part of the mourning process consists in the gradual separation or dissociation between the image we'd like to have of a person and actually what's most real about them.
But what happened with mourning in these days of, well, happiness? We have to be happy all the time.
We're always pushed to not think about losses, to get over losses, with this absurd idea that if we lose someone through separation or death, we have to replace them, find someone else. And of course, how can you ever replace someone you've loved? You can't. Rather, it's a question of finding a way to make their absence a part of your life. What can you do with your loss, rather than how can you replace it, how can you cork it, how can you push it under the carpet? I think that's the crucial thing, and it's becoming more and more crucial in an age where there's less and less place for mourning. Traditional mourning rituals almost no longer exist.
Why is that?
Well, the main reason historically is the multiplication of corpses in the First World War. That's the moment when we see public mourning rituals start to disappear. Until then, if you were bereaved, your clothing could indicate to people around you who you'd lost. Was it a parent? Was it a sibling? Was it a child? How long ago you'd lost them? A year, 6 months, 3 months? Where you were in the process. So immediately, even if you went for a walk in the street, your loss would be inscribed into the social structure. There'd be a social space in which mourning was registered. And today, you can see a sort of emblematic moment in the Kennedy funeral after Kennedy's death. Jackie Kennedy is there, stoic, impassive, not crying, while everyone else in America was, as a sign that grief had to be internalized. It was no longer part of the social structure. That was a change that's been happening since the First World War, when the number of bodies was simply too great to allow the traditional mourning rituals to take place.
You also write about the mourning after Lady Di died. What happened? What happened then?
That's a fascinating episode, because people around the world were sobbing, they were
crying
breaking
on
down,
the streets,
they were in tears. And cynics said these are crocodile tears, they're not based in any real empathy with the family, with Lady Di. But that's totally to miss the point. It's the idea that we're becoming so closed off from any kind of authentic mourning that now the only way that many of us can access grief is through a public event, when a public figure dies. And so the people crying at Lady Di's death, the tears were absolutely genuine, but they just weren't tears for her. The public spectacle of the loss was what allowed people to access for a moment, temporarily, their own grief about other things.
But do you think it's possible to construct new rituals? Do we need them?
Yes, I think people now, all the time, are doing their best to invent new mourning rituals.
Can you give an example of that?
Think about the way that people on the internet now create memorial sites in very interesting and idiosyncratic ways, that they find their own unique solution to what can we do with the space left by the one who's gone. And it's interesting that now, in many parts of the world, the most frequent fate for a dead body is cremation. Yet, in most religions in the world, there's no established ritual for the cremation of a body. So, again, now we see people inventing new rituals to accompany cremations. And that's something which is changing all the time and which historians are documenting.
Art is important. when we're talking about mourning.
Isn't art
Stories.
also a push to create? Just as the erosion of mourning rituals since the First World War has led some people to try and invent new ways, you can say that there's a parallel in art, because art is about creating something from nothing. Most forms of art certainly have that as one of their aims. And I think it's very, very important today. We live in an era where, certainly in Britain, arts funding is being cut on a weekly basis. There's less and less money given to the arts. The arts are considered unimportant. Yet they're incredibly important in that they can show people how making and how creating can take place. And that can actually precipitate, can spark mournings for our own individual losses.
Constructing stories about our lives.
Yeah.
To understand those lives.
And showing that we can build something, we can create something from an experience of loss, rather than trying to replace something or get rid of it or not think about it, that you can actually do something with it in however modest a way. Writing a diary, taking some photographs, talking to other people.
What will happen with the pills? We're using a lot of pills. They're prescribing a lot of pills. What will happen?
A few years ago, everyone said, well, it's the end of pills for depression. All the new studies show that it doesn't really work better than placebo, that it's got serious side effects and so on. But in fact, the prescriptions haven't fallen. In Britain, certainly, the prescriptions are continuing to rise. There's still an appetite for an easy solution, for a solution that allows you not to think and not to speak, because we live basically in an age where there's no longer room for complexity and contradiction at the heart of human life. The thing that novelists and dramatists and poets and artists have always explored, the fact that human life isn't one-dimensional, that people are torn apart by contradictory desires, and yet we live in a culture where the emphasis is on the idea of the self as a unified agency, which is one-dimensional. We just strive for happiness, wealth, one thing, rather than the more complex view, we might strive for happiness and for sadness. We might sabotage our own endeavours while complex, contradictory beings. And there has to be a space to recognise that today.
I thank you.
Thank you.
Ik sprak met Darian Leader over zijn boek Het Nieuwe Zwart. Over rouw, melancholie en depressie. Volgens mij is het een belangrijk boek. Maar oordeelt u zelf.